Welcome to this training on risk data aggregation and risk reporting, RADAR, which is often referred to as BCBS 239. More on that distinction a little later. My name is Conal Devaney. I'm a supervision analyst in the non-financial risk division within Directorate General Horizontal Line Supervision at the European Central Bank. The off-site work for risk data aggregation and risk reporting is coordinated in this division and comprises a team of experts drawn from across the SSM, as well as close cooperation with our colleagues in the on-site function. You'll have the chance to meet some of the other team members at our live session on the 17th of May. As I just said, this is an introduction to the topic of risk data aggregation and risk reporting, and we have split this presentation into 5 sections. First, I will provide an introduction just to put the topic into some sort of context. We will then look at the international standards related to this topic, focusing mainly on the BCBS principles. We will then do a deep dive into the principles from 1 to 11, and we will wrap up by showing you the SSM approach to this topic, including the on and off-site methodology, and a short look at the implementation status, where banks currently stand on this topic. First, to put the topic into some sort of context. As with so many other issues in banking supervision, the origins of the work on risk data aggregation and risk reporting can be traced back to the great financial crisis in 2008. This crisis flagged many weaknesses in banks' risk management, and indeed many of the problems faced by the banks were exacerbated by weaknesses in their risk reporting. This came to a head in light of the subprime mortgage crisis in the US. Key weaknesses that were flagged here were weak and often poorly integrated IT infrastructure. Think in this slide of the many acquisitions that European banks made in the first part of this century, often not always taking into account the complexity of integration of IT systems from separate entities. This often resulted in or went hand in hand with the lack of harmonized data taxonomies across group entities, which in turn led to there being too much time required to aggregate exposures to single counterparties. The result of all of this were serious flaws in risk monitoring capabilities, with management bodies often aware of the risks faced by their own bank. This explains to a large extent why some banks, for example some European banks, weren't fully aware of their exposure to the crisis in the US, just days and in some cases hours before they hit. So what was the reaction of the supervisory community to all of this? In 2013, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision published its principles on effective risk data aggregation and risk reporting. The key aim of these principles was to ensure the improvement of banks' internal risk management, the improvement of their IT infrastructure for reporting information used by the management body, the improvement of group-wide decision-making processes, improvement of information management across group entities, and the reduction of the likelihood and magnitude of losses stemming from weaknesses in risk management. In short, to try and improve all of those processes that had failed in many cases during the great financial crisis. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the 11 principles listed. These can be grouped into 3 overarching sections: governance and IT infrastructure, risk data aggregation capabilities, and risk reporting practices, which we will go into in more detail in the next section. At this stage, it's important to note that globally, systematically important banks were expected to be compliant with these principles already by 2016. Domestically, systemic important banks were given 3 years after the designation as such to comply with these principles. As you will see in the very last section, when we look at implementation status, this has been failed in terms of a deadline by most institutions. So how does the Basel Committee actually define risk data aggregation? Risk data aggregation means defining, gathering, and processing risk data according to the bank's risk reporting requirements to enable the bank to measure its performance against its risk tolerance appetite. This includes sorting, merging, or breaking down sets of data. In terms of the scope, the principles apply to an institution's risk management data and all of its key internal risk management models, including Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and other key risk management models. It's important to emphasize at this point that this applies at both the group and individual entity level. Also, in regard to the scope, it is important to note that as recommended by the BCBS, the European Central Bank considers regulatory and financial reporting to be within the scope of BCBS. This was reinforced by the chair of the Supervisory Board in a 2019 letter to the banks, which we will allude to later. One of the difficulties in supervising risk data aggregation and risk reporting stems in the fact that there is no direct translation of the Basel principles into EU law. Instead, we use a number of EBA guidelines in conjunction with relevant articles in CRD. Some of the guidelines that can be highlighted are the guidelines on internal governance, the guidelines on the SREP, supervisory review and evaluation process, the guidelines on ICT risk assessment under the SREP, as well as the joint ESMA and EBA guideline on the assessment of suitability of members of the management body and key function holders. Within this, it's particularly worthwhile honing in on some of the points mentioned in the EBA SREP guideline. The EBA makes it clear that banks should generate accurate and reliable risk data for business units and the entire institution. That they should capture and aggregate all material risk data across the institution, including group and entity level, generate aggregate and up-to-date risk data in a timely manner, and to generate aggregated risk data to meet a broad range of on-demand requests from the management body or competent authorities. On these last 2 points, we will also mention later. It's not good enough to have timely reporting on paper, but this should be able to be completed also ad hoc in crisis situations. At this point, we can now look at the BCBS principles themselves. For the purposes of this training, we will not look at those principles listed on the right-hand column under supervisory review. Rather, we will focus on the 11 principles aimed specifically at the banks. Of these, as mentioned earlier, we can group into 3. The prerequisites for effective risk data aggregation and risk reporting capabilities are governance and an effective data architecture and IT infrastructure, principles 1 and 2. Without these, it is simply impossible for any bank to fulfill the other requirements. It's important to note that it is our expectation that banks meet all of these principles. Banks can, however, define certain tolerance levels for certain circumstances, such as urgent or ad hoc requests. Data and reports can also exceptionally exclude some information, so long as it does not affect the overall decision-making process. In other words, this should not allow for a situation in which the omission of a certain report would change a management body decision. So let's have a closer look at the 2 main principles, governance, as well as data architecture and IT infrastructure. For governance, we can focus on 3 key aspects: management body responsibility, data governance, and the existence of an independent validation function. To ensure appropriate risk data aggregation capabilities, the management body of each significant institution is responsible for accepting and exercising full responsibility for risk data quality and governance as part of the overall risk management framework. The management body, to ensure this, should select at least one of its members to exercise this responsibility. And indeed, one of the key weaknesses that we have witnessed in the SSM is that banks often have not taken full responsibility at board level for the topic. Banks management bodies should also make sure that RDAR is a key priority for the institution and ensure that adequate resources are dedicated to it. They are also responsible for overseeing, prioritizing, and monitoring key deliverables within the agreed timelines of any remediation programs that the bank has undertaken to achieve efficient radar capabilities. Furthermore, management body is responsible for setting clear roles and responsibilities for radar within the business organization, for ensuring the implementation of policies and standards for radar at the group level, and also, crucially, ensuring that members of the management body and internal control functions have a sufficient understanding of radar-related topics. It should be possible for management board members to challenge senior staff on the content of the risk reports they receive. For this, it's crucial that they have a proper understanding of the topics, and to do this, they should also undertake regular training to ensure that they are up to date with ongoing developments, including, for example, the impact of digitalization on risk reporting. Coming to the next element of governance, the data function, the data governance function. Roles and responsibilities should be defined in the data governance framework. To this end, banks are expected to establish a central function for data governance, usually called the Chief Data Office, headed in most cases by a Chief Data Officer. A central data governance function should be responsible for issuing policies and processes for data quality management, overseeing proper implementation of the data governance framework across the organization, ensuring the evaluation and monitoring of data quality, and participating in change management processes with a material impact on radar. Another vital component of an effective governance framework is the existence of an independent validation function, the primary purpose of which is to ensure that a bank's radar capabilities are functioning as intended. It's important to note that this is not to be equated with an internal audit. The independent validation function is in the second line of defense. If the validation function is located in a function responsible for data governance or risk data aggregation and risk reporting, for example, the risk management function, adequate segregation of duty should also be ensured to avoid conflicts of interest. As is the case with the management body, and indeed the internal audit, it is vital that the internal validation function is well staffed, and indeed the staff have sufficient knowledge in the areas relevant to radar. So what are some of the pros and cons that we have seen in our own supervisory work in this area? Good examples for an independent validation function are those that have organizational setup ensuring independence, that have a 3-year assessment plan with in-depth review of all the principles, and in terms of scope, do not only look at the group level, but also encompass assessments at material subsidiaries. Some bad examples are IVUs that are understaffed. Indeed, there have been some examples where a bank has not had any internal validation unit at all. IVUs that are too dependent on the first line, also for experience and expertise, that have incomplete coverage of BCBS, i.e. do not look at all internal risk reports, where material subsidiaries are perhaps out of scope of the work, and a lack of oversight by the group's second line of defense. One other element to take into account is the planning of new initiatives, i.e. change processes in the bank. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, one of the causes or one of the issues that came to a head during the great financial crisis of 2008 was that while certain banks had acquired a lot of other entities in the lead up to the great financial crisis, they'd failed to really assess the difficulties in integrating the IT systems of these entities into the whole organization. It is therefore very important that banks carry out this work in advance of mergers and acquisitions, in the release of new products, or indeed process enhancements and changes to their IT structure. The effects of such on internal risk reporting should be discussed at management body level and incorporated into any decision that a bank takes in this regard. With that, we can move to the other key principle, Principle 2, data architecture and IT infrastructure. Principle 2 states that a bank should design, build, and maintain data architecture and IT infrastructure which fully supports its risk data aggregation capabilities and risk reporting practices, not only in normal times, but also during times of stress or crisis, while still meeting the other principles. Before diving into the expectations with regard to IT infrastructure, it is worth taking some time to consider what exactly it is we are referring to. The term IT infrastructure refers to a network of interconnected hardware, software, databases, and other components that support the operations of an organization. It often involves a multitude of servers, storage systems, networking devices, and applications working together to deliver various services and functionalities. Managing such infrastructure requires new systems, upgrades, and expansions, making effective management and maintenance paramount for the smooth functioning of business operations. As you see in this illustration, IT environments can be very complex, particularly at larger, complex, and international organizations. One of the main challenges of managing a complex IT infrastructure is ensuring seamless integration and interoperability between diverse systems and technologies while maintaining security and reliability. As with governance, we can hone in here on 3 key aspects: ensuring adequate roles, responsibilities, and controls, data architecture and taxonomies, and business continuity planning. In financial institutions, ensuring data quality is not merely a departmental duty, but a responsibility shared across the entire bank. Data ownership is paramount in this regard, with data owners serving as the first line of defense. They hold the critical task of overseeing essential data elements from the inception to the aggregation process's completion, spanning from the front line to the endpoint. This pivotal role encompasses several key responsibilities. Collaborating with data users to establish data quality controls and classifications that align with defined objectives. Ensuring the accuracy, integrity, completeness, and timeliness of data. Implementing robust monitoring and reporting mechanisms to uphold data quality standards. Taking prompt action to rectify any instances of insufficient data quality. And effectively managing metadata associated with data lineage and the data dictionary, ensuring clarity and coherence throughout the data infrastructure. In terms of the data taxonomy, internal alignment on business concepts and data elements definitions, which involves getting the whole company to speak the same language across divisions and teams, can be time-consuming but crucial. While harmonizing as much as possible is the goal, it's important to recognize that some terms may vary in meaning across departments. Introducing the notion of context can help, allowing for different definitions based on the concept's use. For example, ratings and balances may have varied interpretations depending on the team or scope. This aligns with the concept of a data taxonomy, which organizes and classifies data consistently, ensuring datasets are universally understood regardless of the viewer. This is all the more important again, the more complex and international the institution is. Linked to the data taxonomy is the data dictionary. Essentially, a data dictionary serves as a centralized hub, housing essential details about data, including its significance, connections to other data, origins, usage, and format. This tool is indispensable in risk reporting and aggregation, ensuring as it does that all stakeholders share a uniform comprehension of critical data elements. By promoting consistency, clarity, and accuracy in data interpretation and utilization, the data dictionary plays a pivotal role in fostering effective communication and decision-making processes. In terms of business continuity planning, the processes relevant to BCBS 239, risk data aggregation and risk reporting, should be included in business continuity planning of the institution. The impact of these processes on business operations should be analyzed, for example, through a business impact analysis. The critical business processes and resources, as well as parameters for the restart after interruption, should be determined here. For example, the maximum recovery time. With this, we are ready to move on to principles 3 through to 6, risk data aggregation.